What is up, my brothers and sisters from other misters? We're going to take a look at consumer surplus and producer surplus, and we're going to kind of relate it to a few things. At the outset, just bottom line up front. Although there is, a lot of quantitative analysis and work to be done with consumer surplus and producer surplus, with elasticity of supply, elasticity of demand, from various chapters that you'll be reading here in Principles of Microeconomics by Gregory Mankiw. Standard, textbook across, the country for micro and even macroeconomic students. Again, although there is a lot of quantitative analysis and work to be done, I submit to you that it is the phenomena that we term consumer surplus and producer surplus is on balance much more of a human emotional behavior than it is a rational kind of quantitative activity. Although we use quantitative methods to understand and identify and discriminate between consumer surplus and producer surplus points on supply and demand within an X and a Y axis, in the real world, the phenomena is much more emotional. It is behavioral economics. It is something that you can't exactly put on a supply and demand graph in the moment, right? It just kind of happens. I mean, we can look backwards and graph it and run calculations, and that's fine. We can do that. But this is where, when we use things like sigma notation in the last video, when we use these methods, it's always done looking backwards, okay? So that brings me to another key axiom here. And I guess the first axiom, I didn't clearly, concisely, and completely state it, right? But if I were, I would say the first axiom is something along the lines of that consumer surplus and producer surplus, when they occur in the real world, are emotional and phenomena rather than quantitative phenomena. So then axiom 2 is that economics as a science best works looking backwards. And that's because the laboratory of economic science is history. We can forecast, and there are pretty good models for doing that. We can use business intelligence in order to make predictive analytics at the microeconomic level, or even forecasting at the macroeconomic level. But it's only as good as the data has relevance to reality, right? I mean, yes, past behavior is usually a good predictor of what's to come, but mistakes are always going to be made, and it's never going to be perfect. There is no crystal ball, because you're dealing with people, and this goes back to, even the actual first axiom should be that economics is a social science, meaning it's a science of human action. It's a science of human action because when we study consumer surplus and producer surplus, what we're really studying is human action. And so this is why, even with the best of models, the best forecasting tools and techniques, all the mathematical rigor in the world, and you can still end up making big mistakes, right? A good example of this is the classic case, it's classic now, is long-term capital management, LTCM. If you Google, and I want you to Google real quick, just Google now, pause the video, come back after, a minute or two of reading, maybe even a few more minutes, and watch a little YouTube video on it or something. Long-term capital management, where they were essentially using, formulas in order to forecast risk in order to maximize return, that is, return on investment. And they applied it to financial portfolios and were very braggadocious, might I say, if I may be so bold, very arrogant. This dream team of mathematicians and economists that came together. And and asserted very strongly that they were like a giant vacuum cleaner sucking up all the loose change around the world. And they were making unseen return on investment at unseen rates of return, right? Until there was a surprise surprise in the equation, right? What was that surprise? Well, it was something having to do, I think, in Eastern Europe, and some, something related to decisions that were made in public policy, I think, related to military actions that were going on. I don't quite remember. Maybe Russia was involved. I'm not quite sure on that. You'd have to do your own research on there, search it out online, and you'll find it. But it was a surprise in the algorithm that they had. And so they ended up being the largest bailout, hitherto, right before the 2008 Great Recession. They were the largest single bailout in, like, I think, human economic history. Like, I mean, you got to look into this. It's really crazy. There are like key senators that are still alive today and still serving that were just like grilling them on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. It was pretty insane. So without further ado, let me show you what I mean when I say that. Let me share my screen. And this is Mankiw's textbook that we're using, right? You see here figure 7, consumer and producer surplus in the market equilibrium. The total surplus, the sum of consumer and producer surplus, is the area between these supply and demand curves up to the equilibrium quantity, right? So if you look where my cursor is, okay, I'm putting my cursor around A, the top of that line, right? That is the highest possible price on the y-axis, and I'm circling it, right? That the consumer is willing to pay for, like, let's say, I don't know, some new Jordans, some shoes, some Jordans, right? And let's say that's like $200. And then the lowest price that a producer is willing to pay, point C here on the y-axis, let's say that's $100. Anything above that, they're going, the higher it goes, like climbing up, see my cursor moving up, the higher this price point goes at an agreement with the consumer, right? That represents a higher state of happy or joy, right? Because they're going to have more revenue coming in, which means when you subtract expenses, right, they're going to have more net income profit. So the lowest revenue and lowest net income profit would be down here. The highest would be all the way up here, right? And then obviously starting at point A on the y-axis, moving down, the lower the price point here, the more money that the consumer, he or she that buys those Jordans, has left over, right? So a higher state of joy is in an inverse relationship to the producer surplus's direction of joy or happy, right? Because what happens? Like, let's give a hypothetical. You're going to go in and you're going to buy some Jordans from me, and you're like, oh, this is great. This guy, this guy will say to me, right? He was like willing to bargain. He didn't actually have the price on it. I kind of knew what prices were from shopping online and just kind of knowing the market for Jordans. These Jordans are sick. They got some gold on them. They got some red. I mean, they're going to stand out. I really had to have these. These are like, some really cool Jordans, and I want them. And so he was bargaining with me, and I offered him $150. I thought he was going to charge me like $200 because what I found online was like $250. But this guy, he agreed at like $150, right? So $150 is going to be at that equilibrium point right there, right between producer and consumer. So everybody wins. All boats rise with the tide here. We have, from the graphing perspective, an equal standing in joy or happy, right? And maybe that's true, but what we know is that it's a state of happy and a state of joy, and we can visualize it through these geometric shapes and through through the willingness to buy and willingness to consume, those calculations that we have in the other videos and the other materials that I've shared and that are likely posted in the bottom in the comments linked here as well. Okay, so make sure you read through those. Those are longer propositional knowledge. Propositional is in the written word as opposed to a quick overview like we've done here in this video. It should help to illuminate these key concepts, words, and terms even more. So, all right, see you later.